Welcome. This is our first RelTalk of the semester, and we're really excited for the lineup we have today, but we're especially excited to have Ellen Jordan and Makenzie Schroeder here with us today. RelTalks is a series, a public scholarship webinar series that is sponsored by Relevate. And Relevate is a multidisciplinary team of researchers and practitioners dedicated to increasing access to research on relational and mental health. My name is Paige McAllister, and I'm moderating this talk tonight. And this is our first one, so we're excited. Our presenters tonight are Makenzie Schroeder and Ellen Jordan. Makenzie Schroeder is a master's student in the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. She received her undergraduate degree in communication and public science from the University of Michigan, Flint, and she currently teaches public speaking. Makenzie's research focuses on mediated communication, identity, and diversity. However, her research often intersects with other areas of study, including political and health communication. Specifically, she is interested in exploring stereotypes perpetuated by media and how the portrayal of different identities leads their treatment within society. Makenzie has contributed to research projects related to and ranging from binge eating disorder to health information seeking via social media among women in low to middle income countries. She is currently working on her thesis, which explores media effects and political polarization in the family. Makenzie aims to conduct her research through an intersectional lens with the goal of creating public scholarship to share beyond academia. Our second presenter is Ellen Jordan, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri, studying family communication and health communication. She received her undergraduate degree in communication and journalism from the University of St. Thomas and her master's degree in family science from Concordia University, St. Paul. Ellen's research centers on parent-child communication processes that influence children's and adolescents' mental health outcomes. Specifically, Ellen's work focuses on body image, weight bias, and disordered eating in childhood and adolescence as outcomes associated with parent-child communication. Ellen is a provisionally certified family life educator, and this training informs not only her approach to research, but also her public scholarship. Ellen enjoys translating research findings for families to use in pursuit of their communication goals. To this end, she currently works with extension faculty in the Human Development and Family Studies Department, applying her family life educator training to an extension program and related research. As a public scholar, Ellen hopes to bridge research and practice to ultimately facilitate eating disorder prevention within families. So take it away, Makenzie and Ellen.
First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction, Paige, and thank you for hosting us today. We'd like to start this presentation by asking you all to think about an eating disorder. What comes to mind? Most likely, at least before this presentation, you're thinking of anorexia or maybe even bulimia. Chances are, however, you probably wouldn't have thought of binge eating disorder. But we know that binge eating disorder is the #1 eating disorder in the United States. However, it's an eating disorder that we don't talk about, we don't hear much about, we don't learn a lot about. It's not talked about in media, and it's not necessarily talked about by our doctors, etc. Therefore, today in our research, we're hoping to talk about the role of parent-child communication in binge eating disorder and exploring it further.
There we go. So to this end, our presentation today will focus on 3 primary topics. First, we'll talk about binge eating disorder, what it is, and how it affects those who experience it. Next, we'll talk about specific communication techniques that you can use in your family related to BED. And we'll also then be talking about how families impact children's disordered eating on a broader level, as well as some future avenues for research. But before we get into our presentation, I'd like to introduce you to some of the work that Makenzie and I are doing related to binge eating disorder. So although research exists that looks at eating disorders and binge eating disorders specifically, it doesn't necessarily cover some of the topics that we'd like to see in research. So because of that, we're looking at it ourselves. Firstly, our work looks at binge eating disorder in the context of the family. And what that means is we're interested in looking at how communication between parents and children might play a role in binge eating disorder. And hopefully what we'd like to take out of this is using our research findings to facilitate prevention efforts. We also look at gender in specific because we know that a lot of the existing research looks at women in particular, but we also know that eating disorders affect people of all genders. And so because of that, we're looking at obtaining samples of people who are not just women. Additionally, we take into consideration the fact that BED is unfortunately a stigmatized condition. And what that means is people who experience BED are often discriminated against. And furthermore, we are extremely passionate about research accessibility. We know that a lot of times research gets kind of stuck in these academic journals that are not accessible to the broader population. And so because of that, we engage in talks like this one where we like to inform everybody of what is being discovered.
You're probably wondering at this point in the presentation, however, well, Ellen and Makenzie, this is all great to know, but what exactly is binge eating disorder and what all does it entail? So binge eating disorder is a unique eating disorder characterized by a few different things. One such thing is that it's comprised of consistently eating a lot of food in a short period of time. This is where you get the binge, for example, where you are eating those large quantities of food in a really small time frame. This is also accompanied often by feeling a loss of control over yourself and over your eating. And it's not followed by any compensatory measures, which could include purging after a binge in the case of bulimia, for example. Those who binge also often feel feelings related to shame and distress, right? They feel really bad about themselves. They feel really bad about the binge and everything that it entails. But it's important to note here that binge eating disorder is not always about food. It's not just about food either. It's about our emotions, right? It's a coping mechanism for dealing with these really big emotions, and it just manifests itself in food, which it's also important to note here that people who have binge eating disorder, they're not all fat, right? And let's take a second to think about that word, fat. It probably made us cringe a little, right? Because although it's meant to be a descriptor, it's often used in our society and weaponized as an insult. When people with BED face that same type of fat phobia, because they do consume large quantities of food and the association that that has with fat phobia and eating. Now, before we move on, let's also look at this graphic to our right. We see this pie chart here where there's anorexia and bulimia, and they're actually really small slivers of the pie, yet they're probably the ones that we thought of when this presentation first started. However, we see binge eating disorder makes up nearly half of this pie chart, about 3 times the size of these two combined. Again, really stressing just how prevalent binge eating disorder is. There's also some impacts associated with binge eating disorder, both physical and mental. So some of the physical impacts that an individual might face with binge eating disorder includes weight fluctuations, for example, as well as gastrointestinal issues like cramping. Those with binge eating disorder also often face an inability with concentration. So for example, when I'm doing my homework, I might have a hard time focusing on it. Or if I'm doing work for the day, like something else. Or for example, I might not even be able to focus on my favorite TV show or movie over the weekend. Now, beyond these physical impacts, there are also a lot of mental impacts on those with BED as well. For example, those with BED obsess over their bodies. This often manifests itself in frequent dieting with fad diets. And those with BED also have a really low self-esteem usually, which isn't surprising, unfortunately, given how much stigmatization those with BED or binge eating disorder face. For example, binge eating disorder in the research has been shown not to be taken seriously, unfortunately. It's often instead seen as a lack of control over one's eating or a lack of willpower. And there's a lot of fat phobic associations with that.
Another thing that we're seeing to be connected with binge eating disorder is emotion regulation. So emotion regulation simply refers to your ability to understand your feelings and respond to them appropriately. So for example, if I'm really upset with somebody and I can realize that, I might respond by either yelling at them or just talking to them about how I feel. The way I respond to that emotion will depend on my ability to regulate my emotions. So we're seeing in the research that binge eating disorder is connected with emotion regulation in some really interesting ways. Firstly, we're seeing that binge eating is frequently associated with a lot of these negative feelings like distress and shame. We're also seeing that individuals who binge eat frequently are more emotionally reactive, or in other words, they respond more strongly to their emotions. We also see that frequent binge eating is connected with a lower ability to regulate emotions. And again, because binge eating is often used as a coping mechanism for negative experiences, this really highlights the fact that binge eating disorder is often rooted in emotions. So all of this together suggests that people who experience BED unfortunately are at risk for facing challenges with regulating their emotions. Now, this is really important because emotion regulation plays a big role in our general mental well-being, and this is especially true for children.
In addition to emotion regulation, our research also explores inconsistent nurturing as control theory, which has been applied to things like other eating disorders, as well as gambling, for example. So inconsistent nurturing as control theory, or also known as INC, asserts that those within a dyad are just a group of two people. Within that dyad, there will be a functional partner as well as an afflicted partner. In this case of binge eating disorder, the functional partner, for example, could be a parent who doesn't have binge eating disorder, whereas the afflicted partner might be a child who does. So initially, INC asserts that the functional partner, or parent in this case, will initially nurture their child's binge eating behavior, often because they don't know it's a problem yet. So this might look like keeping excess snacks around the house, or serving really large meals at dinner that you push your child to finish eating. However, once this is labeled as problematic, once the child is labeled as having binge eating disorder, the parent is then going to switch to punishing those behaviors. So this might look like grounding their child for eating all of those snacks mentioned above, or finishing their dinner too quickly, for example. However, once, as INC asserts, this doesn't work, the parent is going to start cycling between these two behaviors of both punishing and nurturing. And unfortunately, this unintentionally reinforces the behavior. It's important to stress here, though, that unintentional aspect of it. We're not trying to assert here that parents are purposely trying to make their child's eating disorders worse. That's totally not the case. Parents are trying to help here, right? Initially, they're nurturing the behavior because they don't know their child has an eating disorder. And then when they do realize it, they try to help their child by punishing those behaviors so the eating disorder stops. However, when that doesn't work, again, this is where we see that cycle because the parent just simply doesn't know what to do. And that's okay. That's not surprising because, again, we haven't heard a lot about binge eating disorder. So, of course, we're not going to know necessarily what to do. But INC does assert here that consistency is key.
And I know this might sound a little scary and doom and gloom, but I promise there is hope here. One communication technique that we'd like to share with you to help kind of protect against these issues is emotion coaching. So emotion coaching can help your kids gain those skills they need to regulate their emotions. When you emotion coach your children, there's 5 steps that you need to take. These steps are recognition, connect and teach, validate, label, and set goals. So in step 1, recognition, this is where you just simply realize your child is going through a big emotion. Then in step 2, connect and teach, you take this opportunity to connect with your child and show them the proper way to respond to that emotion. Then in step 3, validate, this is where you'll validate your child's emotions. Oftentimes, kids who experience big emotions will get punished for acting out, when the main reason they're probably acting out is because they just don't have the skills they need to regulate that emotion effectively. So it's important in step 3 to validate your child's emotions by telling them that it's okay to feel that way, but maybe kicking and screaming isn't the answer. Then in step 4, label, this is where you help your child to realize that that emotion they're feeling is called anger or sadness. Doing this will allow your child to recognize that emotion again down the road. And then lastly, in step 5, we've gotten to the point where you've helped your child to recognize their emotion and know what to do in the future. So it's important in step 5 to set goals and strategize so your child can again just remember this emotion regulation and gain those skills in the future. Now, it might sound like a lot of steps and a lot of work, but the reality is once you practice, you'll get the hang of it. And it can all be as simple as starting out and approaching your child and saying, hey, buddy, it looks like you're experiencing kind of a big emotion or you're feeling, maybe a little upset. Let's talk about that. Even using that simple sentence covers step 1, recognition. You've already shown your child that they're experiencing a big feeling and you're kicking off that process of emotion coaching. So emotion coaching your child can have numerous benefits. First of all, and not surprisingly, your child can gain the skills they need to better manage their feelings. They also will have general mental well-being that's better than it was before. And additionally, emotion coaching your child can help them understand not only their own feelings, but also feelings of other people. Now, you might be thinking your child is either too young or too old to start this process, but the reality is you can emotion coach your child at any age. Children can recognize emotions as young as 3 years old. And so it's never too early or too late to begin this process. But now that we've talked about how communication within the family can impact binge eating disorder, let's take a step back and talk about how families can impact children's disordered eating and body image at a broader level. So research shows that when we talk about weight within the family, that it actually encourages our kids to feel negatively about their bodies and engage in disordered eating. And furthermore, when we tease our kids for their weight or their body size, no matter how well-intentioned it is, or even if it's just supposed to be a joke, this can actually put our kids at risk again for disordered eating. Now, when I say disordered eating, what I mean is things like binge eating, food restriction, extreme weight control behaviors, and purging, all of which are hallmark symptoms of an eating disorder. We also see in the research that when we make comments specifically focused on our children's bodies, that this can objectify their bodies rather than indicating their value. And this is especially true for girls. Now, I know I've said a lot of this here, and I hope I haven't made any of you feel that we're placing blame on the family, because that's just simply not how it is. Unfortunately, we are affected by the broader society we live in of diet culture. And it's important to recognize how diet culture affects our communication, because again, it's not always our fault. Research shows that parents who have been discriminated against for their own weight or body size are actually more likely to restrict their child's food intake. And furthermore, parents who have dieted within the last year are more likely to talk with their kids about weight than they are to talk about healthy habits. And furthermore, when we encourage our kids to lose weight, again, no matter how well-intentioned, this can put them at risk again for disordered eating. Now, even though it is really difficult to avoid the influence of diet culture, we can take an important first step by simply recognizing how it affects our conversations with our children. So, I know we've given you a lot of information here, and you might be thinking, well, this is great, but what can I actually do with my kids to help? Well, now we'd like to give you a few quick tips that you can take into the home to help engage in this preventive communication. The first thing you can do is avoid talking about weight or body size with your kids, because as we know, this can have negative consequences for kids. You can also encourage healthy choices and behavior. Now, this doesn't mean that you should punish your kids when they have a candy bar for a snack, but maybe you could also have some fruit on hand for the next snack. You can also model healthy choices and the desired attitudes that you have for your kids. So research shows that kids are likely to mimic what they see happening at home. So if you constantly talk negatively about your body or your weight, your kids are going to be encouraged to do the same thing about theirs. So if you want your child to have a positive body image, one of the best things you can do is demonstrate that same positive body image in yourself. One more tip is that you can talk about female objectification. Research shows that when we talk with our kids about female objectification, this can help prevent against body image problems, and this is especially true for girls. And another thing you can do is to intentionally talk about emotions with your kids. Even if you don't really know where to start, simply telling your kids how you're feeling can be a really important first step toward emotion coaching. You can also acknowledge when you feel negatively about your child's behaviors. So as Makenzie talked about earlier with INC, we're seeing that once parents realize that their child's eating behavior is problematic, this can unintentionally begin that cycle of behavior that ends up reinforcing the behavior you want to stop in the first place. And so if you start to realize that you feel negatively about your child's eating behaviors, it's important instead to just talk with them and maybe take that moment to connect. And lastly, it's really important that you remember that binge eating disorder is not always about food, but more likely it's about emotions. And so remember that if you notice your child is struggling with binge eating, that maybe it's going to be helpful to focus on the emotional aspect of it, aside from just the food part of it. So considering all of these tips together can really help.
Now, the last tip, and arguably the most important tip that we have for you today, is to just do your best, right? We're here, we're getting educated, and that's a great first step in the right direction. Again, we're not trying to blame parents here, saying that they're purposely worsening their child's eating disorder, because that's exactly not happening. It's not happening at all, right? Instead, we're saying that we have been socialized in a society that is fat phobic and doesn't recognize binge eating disorder, as the research suggests. And that we as people, and maybe as parents, have been socialized by our parents to have fat phobic views and negative thoughts about weight. And their parents have been socialized to do the same, and their parents have been socialized to do the same. So it's this whole cycle of socialization that perpetuates these views and ideas. But again, we're here, and that's what matters, and just doing our best. Now, we also want to share some resources, because maybe we're struggling with an eating disorder, or maybe we know someone else, a friend, a family member who's struggling with an eating disorder, or maybe we think someone is and could just benefit from some resources. Available on the screen, you'll see a helpline from the National Eating Disorder Association. And that number you can call or text. If you don't feel comfortable with either of those options, but still would like to reach out for some resources, there are some online ones that you can utilize, including forums, peer support networks, and support groups that might be helpful. Now that we've talked about all of that, let's talk a little bit more about the research projects Ellen and I are doing, as well as future avenues. So specifically, Ellen and I are working on 2 papers right now. The first paper is about INC, that inconsistent nurturing is control theory, in the context of binge eating disorder. Because again, it's been applied to other eating disorders, including anorexia and bulimia, but we haven't seen anything with binge eating. Now, there's also a paper we're working on in the context of binge eating disorder with emotion coaching, where we're exploring how maybe there can be preventative measures for binge eating disorder. However, although we're doing all of that and what we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, there's so much more we'd love to do, right? But unfortunately, 2 papers can't contain everything. However, we do have some future avenues to suggest, either for us to do in the future or possibly other researchers, or just to look up in general. One such avenue is father-focused communication. So our research specifically just looks at parent-child communication or mother-child communication. But we know, for example, that fathers can contribute to their child's eating disorders, and that they can contribute to how children feel about their bodies, for example. There's also should be more research specific to boys and men, as well as other genders. We know that most of the research when it comes to eating disorders is really just focused on women and girls. But again, we know that eating disorders can impact people of all genders and in unique ways too.
All right. So at this point in our presentation, we've talked about binge eating disorder and how it affects those who experience it. And we've also talked about communication that can play a role in binge eating disorder, as well as future avenues for research. So I hope next time you hear the phrase eating disorder, that you think beyond anorexia and bulimia, and you think about binge eating disorder as well. So we thank you so much for attending our presentation tonight. If you'd like a list of our references, those are available upon request. And at this point, we will now be taking questions.
Thank you so much, Makenzie and Ellen. That was great. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and we will move into questions. So we will keep the questions in the chat. So if you have a thought or a question about the presentation, feel free to put that in the chat. But to get us started, I had a question. So I don't have children, but I do know many people who have children. And so I'm wondering what your advice would be if I noticed a kid was struggling with, I mean, maybe binge eating, but potentially even just body image. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you notice a child that you know might be struggling with an eating disorder or just disordered eating in general, one of the things you can do is talk to their parents. But if you're uncomfortable doing that, one of the best things you can do is simply reach out to that child if you feel comfortable doing that. Having a conversation of, hey, I've noticed this behavior, like, are you doing okay? Approaching it from an are you doing okay perspective can help prevent you from sounding accusatory, but it also shows that you care and there's concern there as well. So that would be a good first step.
To add on to this, I would also say that depending on how often you see this child or person and how often you're around them, maybe it would be also good to model some of these tips in your own interactions with them, such as modeling the healthy behaviors. That might also be helpful. Sure, might not be able to, have a constant presence, in their home, but it matters what happens at your house as well.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks. I was also kind of thinking about like changing how people are socialized around bodies and talking about weight. If they have more examples of people not engaging in those
Exactly. Right?
conversations.
If they have someone who models this really great behavior that's body positive, that can have lasting effects.
Yeah. It looks like we're still waiting for some questions in the chat. So I will ask another question because I have another one. I'm thinking about what from your work on parent-child communication would apply to someone who is themselves struggling with a binge eating disorder or other disordered eating.
I think our theoretical backing could be applicable to anyone, right? So we specifically look at, mother-child communication, but we know, for example, that if we, participate in this emotion regulation, these emotion coaching processes, that can be helpful to us as well. Because again, binge eating disorder isn't just about the food, and it's not focused on the food necessarily. It's about coping with these really big emotions. So maybe we can also apply some of these strategies to ourselves, just being gentle with ourselves as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. As a therapist, when you were going through emotion coaching, I was also thinking like you could emotion coach yourself and validate your own emotions and talk to yourself in very kind ways. Yeah.
100%. And you can emotion coach any age. I know we talked about it specifically for kids, but adults can even be emotion coach. So if you feel like you missed out on emotion coaching as a kid, feel free to do it to yourself.
Yeah. Well, we did get a couple questions in the chat. So Annette Thorson asks, and I'm sure you have an opinion on this, what is your opinion on social media's impact on disordered eating?
Well, that is such a great question. So, and I think it's even interesting seeing how, we think that, the different generations like millennials and Gen Z have grown up with social media, but it's so interesting to see even how it's changed over the years. I think with the rise of, Instagram and even TikTok, we're seeing how with Instagram, pictures are edited in a way that you wouldn't know. You would never know these pictures are edited. And so it becomes really difficult that when you're just scrolling, you think you're just casually scrolling through images. What you're actually doing is reinforcing these fat phobic tendencies because everyone you're seeing is supposedly thin and supposedly in this quote unquote ideal body when, there really shouldn't be an ideal body, but it's in line with what we're hearing. And so in my opinion, at least, I think what makes it really difficult with social media is just we're seeing all this editing that you don't know is there. And so it makes you feel inferior when you don't meet that ideal.
Yeah, especially when there are magazines that are talking about weight, for example, and us being young, I remember seeing magazines where the woman on the cover is being labeled as too fat, right? So when we're seeing those, we know from research in general that any conversation on weight can be negative. But when we're also seeing those negative conversations, especially at that young age, it's really shaping our views on society's expectation for bodies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ali Remick asks, why isn't there more talk about men and boys with binge eating and body image issues?
So that's another good question. So what I think is that a lot of times body image in general even is seen as a women's issue, and even eating disorders are seen as women's issues. Simply, I think because I don't want to make the statement that there's more ideals for women, but I think that's kind of where it started. And obviously there's ideals for men as well as women and other genders, but I think what tends to happen is we start to focus on women within society. I don't know if you would agree, but I think because of that, we see these ideals being played out. Whereas for men, I think it's harder for society to recognize that these ideals exist, because a lot of times those men's ideals are this, muscular man who's manly, quote unquote, but not too manly, because if that's the case, then he's not the perfect middle point. And so I think what I'm trying to say is I think women often get focused on and it becomes a default.
And to add on to that a little bit, I would also say that men are socialized to not talk about these issues, right? Yeah. So we have a lot of toxic masculinity in our society. where men are supposed to have any emotions other than being angry, right? So talking about these really sensitive issues that bring up these big emotions are frowned upon in society for men to do. And I think that's just seeped into, unfortunately, research as well. But an issue that we're hoping to contribute to fixing, as well. And we see that there is starting to become more research related to men and eating disorders. But again, there's so much room for growth here.
And I will add on one more thing I just thought of. I was doing a research project last year where I was interviewing men about their body image. And one person did tell me that in their education system, when they were doing, the puberty videos, he actually watched a video where they talked about body image as only being a female issue. And so that might be the thing as well. It just might be within the education system even, which I think is unfortunate.
Yeah, I think it is framed very much as a women's issue. Yeah. Okay, we have one last question. This comes from Beth Martin. How would you recommend allowing access to snacks for young children? Entire access to what they feel like when they want, or access to only healthy snacks, in quotes, or something else?
I mean, do you want to, we both have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I would just say, to have a balance, right? Because it's, again, binge eating disorder isn't necessarily just about the food, right? Like it does play a role because that's how we're coping with our emotions, but we shouldn't necessarily be completely restricting kids from foods, right? We shouldn't be putting them necessarily on some of these fad diets because, again, that's a part of the disorder too. So it's just as much of a problem. But instead, I think we should really focus on, keeping the healthy snacks too, but eating those healthy snacks, modeling those healthy behaviors, as well as really looking at the root of the problem, right? Which is emotion regulation and working on emotion coaching together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say similarly. I think that is definitely, important. I think for me, if we're talking about how we're going to approach kids snacking, I think it's important not to start out with having rules, because if you start out with having rules, this is where, food restriction comes into play. This is where disordered eating comes into play. So instead, I'd say start by trusting your child to know when they need to eat and when they don't need to eat. And don't worry about having too healthy of snacks, but also make sure that you are having, like Makenzie said, a good balance, because the reality is if the only thing we have in our homes is sugar, that's obviously not the healthiest thing. But on top of that, if the only thing we have is vegetables, for example, that's not really, the most realistic case for everywhere your child's going to go.
Yeah, great. We had a couple questions come in, so I want to be sensitive of time. I recognize that some people might need to jump off, so Makenzie and Ellen, if you're okay staying and answering a couple more questions, I'll ask these. Okay, but I'll wrap up in case there are people that need to jump off. We're so grateful that you were all able to come today, and this was just such great information. If you're interested in more of these topics, we've had previous RelTalks on weight bias and fat phobia. We've also had a previous RelTalk that goes more into emotion coaching, and those are all available on our YouTube channel. Look for a feedback survey from us at some point in your email to get your opinion on how this talk went. And we also have a talk next week, and Jessica King McLaughlin will be talking on supporting women caregivers in the workplace, and it will be very, very good. Okay, so if you need to jump off, that was my little spiel to end, but we've got a couple more questions, and I think these are really good. So Jacob Depoti says, do you think there are gendered biases when it comes to binge eating with girls versus boys, such as boys who eat a lot are just deemed as them being boys or growing?
That is a great question.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I would imagine, yes, that's the case. I think a lot of times when we see young boys or even just what's the word I'm thinking of, elementary age kids. Even so, if you look at how, I don't know if this is still the case now, but at least when I was younger, the boys' jean sizing was something like husky for the larger sizes. Whereas for girls, it was never like that. It was, you were always called fat. And so I think we do see kind of a a lesser stigmatization on boys. And I know that's not the same thing as binge eating, but like Makenzie said, binge eating is often associated with these fat phobia associations.
Yeah.
So that's my first thought on that. I don't know if you have more to add.
Yeah, I would say we can even see, like, related to this, the expectation or allowance in size, or like boys versus girls in this case. Like when we think about gendered clothing, we'll go into stores where women's sizes, or women typical clothing is much more limited in the sizes offered than men typical clothing, for example. So I think we can see examples of this even in just our day-to-day shopping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another great question from Rachel Wood. Does research show that the intuitive eating approach helps prevent some of these eating disorders in children?
That is such a great question. So I haven't looked specifically at research that talks about intuitive eating, but I will say whenever I look into at least therapy practices of managing and dealing with disordered eating and eating disorders, intuitive eating is always the very first thing I see therapists recommending. So that leads me to believe that there is support for intuitive eating being helpful to help treat eating disorders. And so that's kind of why I would suggest when you're talking with your kids or you're choosing what they're going to snack on, just trust them, take that intuitive approach because they know what their bodies are feeling. They know if they're hungry or if they're not.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, I'll just add, as a therapist, and I think this goes into something that you talked about earlier, that like intuitive eating is really focused on a no rules approach, but like really listening to yourself. And I feel like earlier you were talking about how creating rules around food for children kind of sets up some potentially problematic narratives or habits at a younger age of like good foods and bad foods and when we can and cannot eat certain foods. Yeah. Well, great. You do have some praise in the chat. Shay Morrison says this is excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your work and expertise, Ellen and Makenzie. And I will just echo that as we end. This was fabulous. Thank you so much for being a part of our series.
Yay, thank you so much for having us. And thank you everyone for attending. This was fun.
Yeah, we love sharing our research. We would do it every day.
Seriously.
Yeah.